Hello again, it's Father Larry Young, and this is part 2 in my series on drug and alcohol abuse. So why do people get drunk or high? Well, folks have been doing it since the dawn of time for all sorts of different reasons. However, there is one fundamental, underlying, and universal reason. It's the same reason that we do anything that we do, even self-destructive things. We are doing them because somehow we have become convinced that they are going to make us happy. We're all born with a drive toward happiness, but eventually our pursuit of happiness begins to be guided by our philosophical worldview as we get older. And at the deepest level of our philosophical worldview, we find our responses to fundamental human questions like, what's the nature of reality? What's a human person? What's the meaning of life? And is there a God? Our philosophical worldview informs many of our choices in life, and it follows that if we are pursuing happiness by being under the influence of drugs and alcohol, these activities themselves are under a prior influence, so to speak, namely of our own philosophical worldview. So if we're going to talk about drug and alcohol abuse, we have got to talk about philosophy. The choice of our starting point is absolutely critical when we begin to philosophize. What is the most fundamental starting point? Well, I'm constrained in this short little video to speak in very broad terms. But generally speaking, when you survey and boil down the whole history of mankind's philosophical inquiry, there are two basic starting points: realism and idealism. We need to make an important distinction at this point, though, because the way we use the terms realism and idealism in everyday speech is very different than the way we use them in philosophy. In everyday life, we refer to a realist as somebody who just accepts the situation as is, kind of the cynic. Hey, I'm a realist. Then there's the idealist who always sees the potential for a more perfectly realized situation. Oh, they are such an idealist. In philosophy, we mean something very specific. The realist is the person whose starting point for their philosophical inquiry is reality outside of themselves. That's where they begin doing philosophy. Whereas the idealist, they begin in their own ideas. Their starting point for their philosophical inquiry is their own thinking. Far and away, the dominant philosophical starting point in our time is idealism. To be a realist is to be a rebel, to be the gadfly like Socrates was in ancient Greece, to be the fly in the ointment and swim upstream. This is made much more difficult sometimes in a democratic society where, ironically, it's more difficult to be truly free-thinking because there's even a subconscious underlying presupposition that the majority must always be right. Well, I have the audacity to assert that the majority is wrong about this starting point of idealism. I am a defiant, dissenting, rebel realist, and I'm going to be critiquing idealism. Then I'm going to make the case for realism. Then I will attempt to answer this question of whether getting high or drunk is truly ordered to our greatest human happiness. And I'll be doing this from a realist starting point, so buckle up. Modern idealism is traceable to the 14th century with William of Ockham, who denied the existence of any universal natures or essences that we are able to intellectually abstract and come to know. The only thing linking individual things to each other is not a nature that they share, but simply a name that we've chosen to give them. This way of thinking became known as nominalism, and seeds of doubt were now sown about the prevailing realist position of the day, which was founded on Aristotle and the 12th century doctor of the church, St. Thomas Aquinas. Occam was reacting to incidental excesses in the medieval scholastic period of philosophy, which were in fact real, but he went too far in his efforts to oversimplify everything with his famous razor. He ended up sawing on the branch that he and the rest of Western civilization were sitting on. The wrecking ball of doubt began swinging wildly and knocking everything over. People no longer felt tethered to reality. They were alone in the dark, wondering if they even exist anymore. Fast forward to the 17th century philosopher René Descartes. He attempted to ground our existence in our own thinking. He argued that even if we doubt the existence of all of reality, we cannot doubt the fact that we are thinking. His famous dictum was, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. At the very least, we can know that we are thinking things. This approach of extreme doubt and skepticism about the outside world finished the work of Occam's razor, and the branch was sawn all the way through. The knowing subject was now cut off from objective reality entirely. Fast forward to another philosopher of the 18th century known as Immanuel Kant, who developed an entire systematic approach to philosophy. It was a failed attempt to reconcile realism and idealism, but in the end, it amounted to an absurd contradiction. On one hand, he tries to hold that there's a self-evident truth that reality is real, which sounds an awful lot like he starts out as a realist, but then he refers to the existence of the thing in the outside world as a noumena, and holds that all we actually know is the phenomena. He claims we cannot know the noumena or the thing itself. We can only know the phenomena in our own thinking. So we somehow know things exist, but we don't know for sure what they are. Once again, we remain cut off from the outside world and trapped within our own thinking. Kant is a pseudo-realist, but fundamentally his philosophical approach is an idealist one that became the foundation for much of modern thought. Idealism begins with this fundamental doubt or skepticism about the ability of our knowing powers to grasp the outside world around us. This inevitably leads to subjectivism or relativism, where all we're left with in the end are our own opinions or beliefs, and we cannot make an assertion about what is truly the case in reality. The classic definition of truth from a realist standpoint is the conformity of the mind with the thing. From an idealist starting point, however, the mind and the thing have been hopelessly sundered. The conditions for objective truth to even occur no longer exist from an idealist starting point. For the idealist, there are no knowable essences of things, or universal truths, or transcendent principles. We are ultimately isolated and cut off from the outside world, and that includes also from each other. We can no longer dialogue with each other in a meaningful way about what is truly the case in reality, because even if our assertions are completely contradictory, they will both remain true for us. From many contemporary idealist starting points, it's like there's no longer any objective criterion for truth. So whatever we happen to be thinking must somehow be true. What if we change our minds to something that completely contradicts what we used to think? Were we wrong and now we're right? Or were we right and now we're wrong? Or were we right then and now we're right again? Or what if we're right about being wrong about being right? In this idealist environment that we're living in today, it's easy to understand how this philosophically undergirds the further flight from reality into the abuse of drugs and alcohol. When we cut ourselves off from objective reality, we remain lost within ourselves. trapped in a dead end, with no hope of discovering the ultimate meaning of our being and existence and of the world around us. Where are we going to get the answers within to the fundamental human questions of who am I? Do I have a soul? Why is there evil and suffering in the world? What's the meaning of my life or of my death? Is there life after death? Is there a God? There is today a crisis of meaning that stems from this idealist starting point. And it's understandable that those who suffer this crisis of meaning would seek to medicate themselves in any way they can. I would like to propose a different starting point for our philosophical inquiry. Not our thinking, but rather reality itself. Realism is a philosophy that is open to being, that asserts that reality is knowable, that it's reasonable, and that it's within the grasp of our knowing powers. We ought not fundamentally doubt our knowing powers. That defies logic and common sense. Reality is not a dream, either ours or someone else's. When we wake up in the morning, cannot we distinguish our waking state from our dreaming state? Reality is not an illusion, hallucination, hologram, matrix, or computer-generated simulation. We are not brains in a vat. Reality is not some kind of virtual video game. Reality is real, and it's intelligible. Don't we all know that deep down? We all begin life as realists, and we live out our practical day-to-day existence as realists. But there's the ever-present temptation for human beings to run from reality. However, reality is where it's at. The realist begins with reality. The realist says, res sunt, ergo cogito. In other words, things are, therefore I think. We aren't just beings who are capable of thinking, we are beings who are capable of knowing. And knowledge is what the realist is concerned with, which is the grasp of things in the outside world. According to the great 20th century realist philosopher Etienne Gilson, the birth of the concept presupposes the fertilization of the intellect by the reality which it apprehends. I'll say it again. The birth of the concept presupposes the fertilization of the intellect by the reality which it apprehends. In other words, our intellect is impregnated by reality. Being is somehow prior to knowing. There's a natural movement from being to knowing. This is common sense, and realism is a philosophy of common sense. It's a philosophy of being. All sound reasoning begins with this self-evident truth that reality exists and that it's knowable by us. Reality is ultimately inexhaustible or incomprehensible to us in its fullness. That's why we don't claim to be wise. We just simply claim to be philosophers or lovers of wisdom. As Socrates said at his trial in the 4th century BC, only God is truly wise. Of course, we can be wrong about what's truly the case in reality. There's no doubt about that. That's why we have to remain modest about our knowing powers. But that doesn't stop us from continuously seeking greater and greater conformity of our minds with the real in dialogue with others. Human knowledge is not the measure of reality. Rather, reality is the measure of human knowledge. Here's a simple demonstration that can illustrate my point. This is a spark plug. Now, I'm going to hide this spark plug in one of my hands and ask you to pick which one you think it's in. Now, those of you who chose the right hand were correct. So your merely thinking it did not cause it to be so, but truth happened. There was a correspondence or conformity of your mind with the thing, with what is truly the case in reality. Good job. Those of you who chose the left hand were in fact wrong, but you learned something through this whole process. And we can all learn something through this demonstration, and that is that our minds are fundamentally receptive to being. To become a genuine philosopher is to passionately seek the truth with all our hearts, to cultivate within ourselves this contemplative gaze upon the real, to experience reality deeply, to be filled with wonder and awe at the mystery of things all around us, to become an interesting person who plunges into the midst of being, inter esse. To be a genuine philosopher is to be an explorer who learns to continuously come back to everything in their ordinary lives in a fresh way. This philosophical approach to life was beautifully described by a poet of the 20th century, T.S. Eliot, in his famous work of poetry, The Four Quartets. We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive at where we started and know the place for the first time. The more our appetite is awakened for reality, the less and less we will seek out this counterfeit reality of being drunk or high. This is your brain. This is your brain when you become an authentic philosopher. Here's an easy experiment you can try. Get together with your friends in a nice, comfortable, relaxing environment. And instead of passing around a bong, bowl, or joint, or doing ridiculous keg stands, pass a book of poetry around and read it out loud and then discuss it with a clean and sober mind. You will leave feeling enriched and stirred, and you won't be strung out with the munchies or hungover. If we are a true lover of wisdom, then we're going to spend our leisure and recreation time in doing things that truly enrich us, edify us, and build us up. Developing friendships, geeking out on subjects that interest us, learning skills and starting projects, delighting in the arts and culture, sports and exercise, exploring the world around us. Engaging reality is an adventure, and in it is the path to genuine happiness and human fulfillment. So if you want to geek out some more on all this good, solid, realist philosophy, I'm going to post down below names of some philosophers that I trust implicitly, who've made lots of YouTube videos and have podcasts and have written books. People like Peter Kreeft, Rhonda Chervin, Alistair McIntyre, Stephen Brock, and Matt Fradd. In the next video, I want to talk about the spiritual life in a lot more detail and how it relates to this issue of drug and alcohol abuse. We've spent a lot of time here talking about it from the perspective of reason. Now let's look at this issue through the lens of faith. God bless you.